Hello guys, now we are on the third game in the strategy of the center, and this game is played between Reti and Nimzowitsch. And in this game it starts with an English opening. So the game goes c4, e5, knight f3, e4, knight d4, knight c6, knight c2, bishop c5, knight c3, knight f6, d4, ed3, ed3 and d5, d4. Both sides have played unconventionally. The pawn setup starts to resemble the French defense exchange variation. Now after White wanted to gain some tempi, advancing his d pawn. Now bishop e7, now c5, and now bishop f5. Black will first activate his troops. White must be wary of the attacks with b6. There is also already a direct attack to d4. Here if at all b6, then bishop b5, bishop d7, and both sides short castles. Doesn't give black anything. Nimzowitsch managed to attack the white pawn chain in better fashion. So he goes bishop f5 and bishop d3. Here even bishop b5 is another option. Now after castles and knight to e3, there is bishop g6 and then short castles and then queen to d7 is one of the possible continuations. Black is doing perfectly fine here. Now bishop d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3 and b6, and this is the right moment. Now castle shot. Here instead of castles, if at all cb6 and ab6 is excellent for black. And now castles and then bishop g5. Now h6, and here bc5, dc5 and knight to e5, and there is queen g3 attacking the knight on e5. Black doesn't have the time to play c6, so we c6 and the c. So here d takes c5. If at all bishop takes the pawn on c5, then there is then there will be this. This is coming, so and here, so that now after h6, bishop h4, if at all takes bishop takes on f6, there is bishop takes on f6. This is also another option for white, and black's position is very solid. So after bishop h4, Now b c5, d c5 and knight e5, queen to d4. Here if at all queen g3, then knight g6 is coming. Now threatening knight h4 and also knight e4 is coming. So that was the point of h6. So after queen d4, now knight g6. So now this was the point of the move h6, and now the bishop is on h4. Now it is attacked and black is able to support the pawn on d5. Now after bishop g3, here even bishop takes f6, then queen takes d5, bishop takes c3, and queen takes d8, rook f takes d8, and b takes c3, and rook to d5 must be in black's favor. His rook on c5 will both attack the weak pawn on c3 and protect the c7 pawn. So white did not take on f6. He went bishop g3 and now c6. The c5 pawn is fixed and the d5 pawn is supported. Now knight b4, intending to put the knight on d3, protecting c5 and blockading the passed d pawn. White understands the blockade on d4 would not be sufficient. On the other hand, black successfully finished development and already slightly better. The main factor for such an evaluation is white's exposed pawn on c5 fixed on a dark square. Black's bishop will be more dangerous. Even the black's knight can find good squares. Now rook c8. The rook will be temporarily a defender. The b8 square is controlled by the white bishop. Meanwhile, the black queen can be active, probably on a5. Now h3. This is an inaccurate move. Here knight d3 was much better. Now rook e8, rook a d1, knight f8 and knight d3, queen a5. Here knight e6 was natural and also a very good move, but Nimzowitsch gives chance to white to exchange queens. Now queen a4. If at all b4 is played, then queen a3, and after black puts knight e6, black would destroy the white pawn structure by playing a5. So now queen to a4, queen takes a4, knight takes a4, knight e4 and bishop h2 and knight to e6. And there is total disharmony in white's army. Take a look at white knights, which must protect the weak c5 pawn. Black knights are perfectly placed, controlling the entire center. It is very useful to place the knights and pawns on the same colored squares and the bishop on the opposite color. Now b4, knight d4. Now rook fe1. There is a threat of f3 now, because if at all f3 is played now, there is knight e2, king h1 and knight 4, g3 check. So that first rook fe1, bishop h4. He who dominates in the center can play on the flanks. Now there is a pressure on the f2 pawn. Knight bishop e5. This is a blunder. Now instead of this, if at all g3 is played, there is knight f3. So here king, this was correct. After bishop e5, rook takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes f2 check, king f1, bishop takes e1, rook takes d4. If at all rook takes e1, then knight c2 is coming. Rook c1 and knight takes b4. So now at all the king takes, then there is again knight c2, the same knight c2. So the knight on d4 must be taken. Now bishop g3, knight f3, rook e8, keeping the white king in a prison while threatening mate on e1. Now rook d1, rook e6. Black's idea is to play knight g5 and then put the rook on f6 and bring to f2. Now rook c1, king f8. Black patiently activates his king. Knight c3, knight takes c3, rook takes c3, rook e4, a3, king e8, rook d3, a6, rook d4. White desperately wants to get rid of black's ultra active pieces, but simplifications are in black's favor. Now f5, a4, king d7, b5, ab5, ab5, cb5, rook takes d5 check, and sorry, yes, check, and now white's problem is he cannot capture on f5. After king c6, if rook takes on f5, then there is b4, rook to f8, there will be b3, and the b8 square is controlled, rook d8, and b2, and rook after rook d1, there is rook c4, and after knight to d2, rook c2 will win. So that white cannot take on f5. He goes rook d4. Now king takes c5, rook takes e4, f takes e4, knight d2, and the rest of the game is just a matter of technique. Now king d4, king e2, bishop f4, knight b3 check, king c4, knight a5 check, and king c3, king knight b7, b4, knight c5, king c2, g3, bishop takes g3, and white resigned here. One of the most illustrative games ever on the topic of centralization and harmony. This is a masterpiece by the great Nimzowitsch. So thank you all.